Welcome to the deep dive. You might think you have a handle on how workplaces get organized, but today we're peeling back the layers. It's a really fascinating and actually deeply historical kind of dance.
Hmm.
It's this complex interplay between employees, employers, and the state, especially, when it comes to who represents whom.
Right.
And in a place like South Africa, this dance hasn't just shaped the economy, it's really molded the whole fabric of society.
That's absolutely right. Our mission today is to take a proper deep dive into these core players in labor relations. We'll be looking at their definitions, exploring their often surprising origins,
Yeah, that part's really interesting.
understanding their diverse classifications,
Yeah.
and seeing how they actually operate in the real world.
Exactly. We'll
Yeah.
specifically explore the crucial role of collective organizations, from powerful trade unions to employers' associations, and then we'll look at the state's unique position. It often acts as a kind of third party, a mediator almost.
Yes, the referee,
Yeah.
sometimes.
And to really bring it home for you, we'll unpack the rich and often quite dramatic history of these movements, specifically in South Africa, tracing them from the early 20th century right up to today.
And understanding these dynamics is, well, it's crucial for anyone looking to quickly grasp the forces driving economic stability, social justice, and even, your own daily experiences at work.
Yeah, absolutely.
This deep dive should give you a shortcut, really, to being well informed about a truly impactful area.
And we're drawing from some pretty comprehensive material today, a resource titled Labor Relations, a Southern African Perspective. It gives a really detailed look at these key actors and how they've evolved. So let's get into it.
Okay. So at its heart, any robust labor relations system involves a three-party relationship.
Right.
You've got the state, you have employees, almost always represented collectively by trade unions, and then you have employers, usually represented by management or through these formal employers organizations.
And what's really striking in South Africa, as you pointed out, is that this relationship almost always deals with collectives. It's rarely just about individuals.
Precisely. It's these organized groups and their collective power. The union, for instance, is often the one initiating action, with employers and the state then reacting.
Okay.
So let's kick things off with trade unions. Now, the exact definition might differ slightly, across Southern Africa, Zimbabwe, and Namibia. But South Africa's Labor Relations Act defines a trade union as, well, basically an association of employees whose main purpose is to regulate relations between employees and employers, including any employer's organization.
That's a solid starting point. But it's tracing the history, the lineage that's really fascinating. You might think unions are purely modern, but the roots go way back.
Surprisingly far,
Yeah.
even to medieval guilds.
Yeah.
But the modern trade union movement, as we kind of understand it now, really took shape with the Industrial Revolution in Britain.
Right.
So late 18th century, you saw these friendly societies pop up, groups of craftsmen pooling small weekly amounts for mutual support, sickness, unemployment, death.
Simple mutual aid.
Exactly. But the state wasn't keen. The Combination Acts of 1799 and 1800 actually banned these collective bodies.
Wow. So they had to operate in secret.
They did, underground, essentially. But then came a huge moment, the repeal of those acts in 1824.
Okay.
This finally allowed workers to combine, even to strike, within limits. It marked the state's first real tentative steps towards worker protection. It paved the way, though it took until after 1850 for permanent unions, mainly skilled craftsmen, to really establish themselves.
And those early British struggles, you can see the echoes globally, right? Especially in South Africa, where collective action led to these two really seismic armed labor revolutions.
Absolutely seismic. First, the Rand Rebellion of 1922 in Johannesburg,
A major event.
and then, much more recently, the Marikana Massacre in 2012.
Both just incredibly impactful. They shattered complacency, forced fundamental shifts in labor relations. The Rand Rebellion, for instance, led to unions like Solidarity, with its religious base, and the Industrial Workers of Africa, the IWA, which was more political, socialist.
Yes, stark reminders of the often violent struggle for rights.
Yeah. Definitely. Okay, so how are unions actually classified? You mentioned it's not always clear-cut, but there are traditional categories.
Right. Traditionally, three main types. First, you've got occupational unions, which our source calls niche unions.
Niche, okay. Highly specific then.
Very specific. Within that, you have craft unions, like the South African Typographical Union, SATU, the oldest craft union in the country, actually. Their power came from the scarcity of their skills.
Hard to replace.
Exactly. Then promotion unions, like the United National Transport Union, UNTU, for railway workers' skills often learned on the job. You also saw unskilled and semi-skilled unions rising. their power, mass organization, making it hard to use replacement labor, scab labor. This was potent in South Africa because of the historical link between skill and race.
Right. That historical context is key.
And then, with the shift to service economies, you get white-collar or professional unions, like BFOWU for bank and finance workers. Their presence has really grown, showing how unions adapt.
So those occupational ones are niche, but then there's this broader model uniting all workers in an industry.
Yes, the industrial or sectoral unions, a very powerful idea.
What was the thinking behind that?
The philosophy was simple but strong. Sweep every worker in an industry into one big union. The rallying cry was literally one shop, one union.
That sounds like it would create real strength. What are the main advantages?
Oh, significant advantages. Much stronger unions, obviously. It eliminates that damaging inter-union rivalry within a sector.
Right.
Fewer bargaining partners for employers, which can actually simplify things. It facilitates centralized, industry-wide bargaining and generally improves planning for the whole industry. Think of unions like SAMW for municipal workers, or IMOET2.
Okay, got it. And beyond even that, there are the general unions.
Yeah, these are open to pretty much any worker, regardless of sector, skill, whatever. The Transport and General Workers Union, TGW, is a classic example. They started with this grand idea of organizing the entire working class.
So beyond structure, let's talk objectives. You mentioned it's way more complex than just asking for more money.
Oh, absolutely. Broadly, it falls under the banner of achieving decent work.
Decent work, what does that encompass?
A whole range of things. Protecting wages, yes, but also employment security, social policies like housing and transport, dealing with modern issues like HIV/AIDS and pandemic policies.
Right, adapting to the times.
Regulating hours and leave, promoting equality, pushing for Social Security, broader social justice. Also championing training, advancement, a safe work environment, gender equality, parental rights. It's comprehensive.
It really is. But you mentioned this tension with economic concerns. Can you unpack that a bit? It sounds almost paradoxical.
It is, yeah. Improving members' economic standing is job one, right? A union that doesn't deliver financially won't last long.
Sure.
But there's a tightrope. If large industrial unions push demands too high, it could potentially harm the economy long-term or even lead to job losses for their own members.
So they sometimes have to moderate their own demands.
Sometimes, yes. Surprisingly, unions can become these sort of reluctant guardians of the broader economy, tempering wage demands to ensure long-term stability. It's a complex calculation.
And you said their objectives go beyond just economics, drawing them into politics. How does that work?
Well, saying unions shouldn't be political is just unrealistic. Their members live in this society, they're affected by politics, so unions have to represent those interests. They are inherently political forces.
Especially in places like South Africa.
Exactly. Where grassroots opposition forced union leaders into becoming crucial political campaigners, fighting for systemic change. It was unavoidable.
So, given all these goals, how do they actually try to achieve them? What are their main methods?
They use a whole toolkit. Collective bargaining is key, obviously.
Yeah.
Collective action like strikes, direct representation in the workplace, affiliating with bigger federations, lobbying the government directly, and, as we said, significant political involvement.
And underpinning all of that is this idea of the power objective. Is that both a goal and a tool?
Yes, exactly. Achieving power is an objective in itself, but it's also the fundamental means to achieve everything else.
Makes sense.
A union's power depends on critical factors. Member solidarity, absolutely crucial. The depth of its organization, the skill of its negotiators, the sympathy it gets from outside bodies, its ability to influence government, business, international groups. Without power, the rest is just talk.
Okay, now let's look inside. The structure of unions. You said it's hierarchical, a bit like a business.
In some ways, yes. Starting at the base, you have the general membership.
Right.
Then in the workplace itself, members elect shop stewards. They're the direct link to management on day-to-day issues.
The front line, really.
Absolutely. These stewards might then form shop steward committees within a company or across sites.
Okay, and above that?
Often you have local branches. These are really the core coordinating activity, recruiting being that vital link between the grassroots and the higher levels.
Got it.
Branches usually send reps up to a regional committee in some unions.
And then national.
At the top, you've got the National Committee, setting overall policy and strategy, and the National Congress. This is made up of reps elected from the grassroots. It's supposed to be the ultimate decision-making body.
Supposed to be.
Well, yeah. And beyond that, unions can affiliate with national federations, even international bodies. It creates this potentially massive network.
So ideally, this structure means management by the people, right? Members elect leaders, the Congress decides policy, authority rests with the members.
That's the democratic ideal, yes. And usually, the paid officials and organizers, the union's employees, they advise, but typically don't get a vote in committee decisions. It reinforces that member-led idea.
But here's where it gets interesting, you said. The challenges to that democracy. It doesn't always work out like the ideal.
Sadly, no. There are common problems. Unions can get dominated by factions or by long-serving leaders who start pursuing their own agendas.
Right, power corrupts, potentially.
And the expert officials, the full-timers with all the knowledge, they can end up having huge, sometimes controlling influence. Plus, day-to-day decisions often have to be made quickly without consulting everyone.
Impracticality.
Exactly. And critically, members themselves can just be, well, apathetic. They only really get involved when there's a crisis.
That's a huge challenge. And what about the individuals who rise to the top? Does that create its own issues?
It absolutely can. People in top union jobs gain substantial power. They influence lots of people, become public figures. And this can sometimes lead to a power complex.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, where the individual starts to see themselves as more important than the union or its members. It can really undermine democracy and member welfare. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? How easily democratic tools can be misused.
Makes you wonder what safeguards actually work against that. So is it just a constant battle to keep it democratic?
Many theorists think unions cycle through phases. Democracy, then oligarchy ruled by a few, then back to democracy when members get fed up and push for change. Then the cycle repeats.
A continuous cycle. So despite these problems, what do unions do to try and promote democracy? What safeguards do they use?
They try to involve members as much as possible, get shop stewards involved in negotiations, report back frequently and transparently, make sure the national executive has people from all across the membership base, not just one small group.
Okay. I can see how employers might want what they call responsible leadership from unions, meaning leaders who can make quick decisions, maybe keep members in line. But that clashes with democracy, doesn't it?
Fundamentally, a union leader who has to constantly report back or stick strictly to a majority decision can't always give instant answers or control members like an employer might want. So that call for responsible leadership often pushes against the union's democratic nature.
Right. And then there's this concept of trade union discipline. What's that about?
Well, a union is a collective. You join voluntarily. Once you're in, you agree to abide by the collective's rules and decisions. If you strongly disagree, you can leave, of course. But you can't just act individually or ignore collective decisions whenever you feel like it, especially if you're an office bearer. It's about solidarity, even when there are internal disagreements.
Okay. This all brings us nicely to the shop steward. You called them pivotal. Why are they so important day to day?
Think of them as the workplace nerve center for the union. They're the first port of call for grievances, the negotiators for small issues, the information pipeline between the union and members.
Right on the ground.
Exactly. Elected by members, recognized by management, doing union work during their employment. They really embody that daily push and pull for power and rights at the grassroots level. They're the linchpin.
What makes a good shop steward? It sounds like a tough job.
It is demanding. They need respect and trust from the union, their colleagues, and management. They need to be great communicators, objective, able to make quick decisions sometimes, and absolutely committed, diligent, fair, and knowledgeable about union rules, employee rights, even basic management stuff.
And their duties. You listed a lot. They're doing all this on top of their regular job.
A lot of it, yes. Recruiting, helping with grievances and discipline, consulting on plant-level stuff, getting mandates from members, organizing ballots like strike votes, making sure agreements are followed, running meetings, sitting on committees like health and safety,
Wow.
advising employees, keeping information flowing, collecting dues, working with the local branch. It's a massive list.
Given all that, what's maybe the single hardest part of their role? Balancing individual needs versus the union's bigger goals.
That's a really good question. Yeah, I think balancing the immediate, often emotional needs of one worker against the union's long-term strategy is probably the toughest part.
Right.
You might be defending someone in the disciplinary hearing, but you also have to think about how that case affects future bargaining or workplace relations overall. It's a constant balancing act between advocacy and strategy.
And do they get any special rights or time off for doing all this?
They do. While a lot happens in their own time, they are allowed reasonable time off during work hours for urgent union tasks representing members' negotiations. Employers shouldn't unreasonably refuse this. And crucially, they get time off for specific union training, which is vital for them to be effective.
And sometimes, in big places, you get full-time shop stewards.
Yes, laws or agreements sometimes provide for them, usually based on the size of the place and how many union members there are. They stay on the employer's payroll, but focus entirely on union duties. It can really help stabilize relationships and improve communication.
Though challenging for management to cover their jobs, I guess.
It can be, logistically, but often seen as worth it for better industrial peace.
Yeah, let's switch sides. Who exactly is the employer now? You said it's rarely just one person owning the business.
That's a key point. Theory uses employer, but in reality, it's almost always management. Most businesses are owned by shareholders who aren't involved day to day. Management are the appointed representatives running the show.
Right. So what are management's main goals? Yeah. And how do they generally view unions?
Core goals: maximize profit, ensure the company survives and grows, expand market share, keep customers happy, use resources efficiently, and yes, look after employees.
But profit is usually king.
Often the main driver, yes. But
Yeah.
the so what here is that companies are increasingly seen as having broader societal roles. It's not just about profit anymore.
How so?
There's growing pressure to consider how wealth is created, balancing profit with things like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, reducing inequality, responsible consumption. Employers have a duty beyond just the bottom line now.
Okay. And their attitude to unions? Still reluctant partners.
Well, let's be honest, most employers would probably prefer to operate without unions.
Yeah.
To run things their way without external checks on wages or conditions.
Mm.
But unions are now, as the source says, endemic to the pluralist system. They're a permanent feature. So employers have largely accepted their presence. They've learned to coexist, maybe not always happily, but as peacefully and productively as possible. It's an uneasy but necessary relationship.
Just like workers form unions, employers form their own organizations. Why? Especially when an individual boss already has power, like hiring and firing.
That's a great point. An individual employer has power, yes. But combining gives them a strong collective counterbalance to unions.
Leveling the playing field.
Exactly. It helps standardize conditions across an industry, stops unions playing one employer off against another. It protects smaller businesses that can't afford high wages. It provides expert negotiators they might lack individually. And it gives them a unified voice to government and other bodies.
So what are the key functions of these employer organizations?
They're a forum for developing strategy. They negotiate with unions for industry-wide wages and conditions. They help members with info on laws and procedures, coordinate benefits and training, lobby government, liaise with union federations, and talk to the media to get their side across.
And their structure? Similar to unions again.
To some extent, yeah. Though usually less focus on mass recruitment. A key challenge, though, is that big companies often dominate these bodies, especially if voting is based on company size. Smaller employers' interests can get overlooked sometimes.
And their future. Are they still relevant if bargaining moves more to the company level?
Their role as the primary negotiators might shrink in some areas where plant-level bargaining takes over. But they remain absolutely vital as a collective voice for employers when dealing with unions and government. And as advisory bodies providing expertise, especially on complex labor law, their role is changing, definitely, but they're far from irrelevant.
Okay, finally, the state, the third party. How does South Africa handle this role? You mentioned a corporatist approach.
Yes. Post-1994, South Africa deliberately went for a more corporatist model. Think NEDILAC, the National Economic Development and Labor Council.
Right.
The idea is to formally bring organized labor and business into the tent, involved in making economic and social decisions with the state, trying to build cooperation and consensus rather than just having conflict.
So what are the government's specific goals in this, especially around labor?
Well, within this, the Department of Employment and Labor is key. Its mandate is broad. Reduce unemployment, poverty, inequality through policies developed with these social partners.
So collaboration is built in.
Ideally, yes.
Yeah.
Aiming for economic efficiency, job creation, sound labor relations, workplace equality, poverty reduction. It's ambitious, highlighting the state's role beyond just being a mediator.
But despite all these structures and goals, South Africa still struggles with deep economic and social problems. So this raises a big question. How much do these labor relations dynamics of the roles of unions, employers actually impact the wider economy? Investor views, where are the real blockages?
That's the ongoing complex challenge, isn't it? The persistent problems, whether from history, policy issues, corruption, They just highlight the need for everyone, state, labor, business, to constantly reassess and adapt. The level of trust and stability in that three-way relationship directly impacts investor confidence, economic growth. If that dance isn't working, the whole economy feels it.
Okay, so let's dive into South Africa's unique journey now, starting with the legal basics. Do unions and employer groups have to register with the state?
Legally, no. It's not mandatory under the Labor Relations Act of '95. But, and this is a big but, there's a massive incentive.
Which is?
Almost all the important legal rights, workplace access, holding meetings on site, electing recognized shop stewards, those are only granted to registered organizations. An unregistered union technically has no statutory rights, even if it can make basic agreements.
So registration is pretty crucial in practice. What does it involve? Sounds like paperwork.
It is quite detailed. You apply on a form. Need a unique name, a constitution with specific things in it, nonprofit status, clear membership rules, solid financial management, ballot procedures, how it would wind up, need a physical address, and crucially, must prove independence from employers.
And the big payoff for doing all that.
Registration gives you juristic person status.
Yeah.
Legally, you become your own entity.
Why is that so important?
It protects individual members. They can't be held personally liable for the organization's debts or actions. So, members, officials, shop stewards are shielded. Plus, registered bodies find it way easier to get formal recognition from employers and join bargaining councils, those key negotiating forums.
Makes sense. But with rights come responsibilities, I guess. Obligations.
Absolutely. Extensive ones. Keep meticulous member lists, proper financial records, annual audited statements, open to members' inspection, submit audit reports to the registrar, keep records and ballot papers for at least 3 years, provide lists of members and office bearers annually. It's about transparency and accountability.
And once registered, what specific rights do majority unions and their shop stewards get under the Act?
The Act gives majority unions quite broad rights. Guaranteed workplace access, right to hold meetings on site, stop order facilities getting dues deducted from salaries, reasonable time off for officials for union duties.
And for the shop steward specifically?
They get specific rights too, if they're from a majority union. Assisting employees in discipline and grievances, monitoring if the employer is sticking to the Act and agreements, reporting breaches, and taking reasonable paid time off for their duties or for relevant training.
So how does a union actually start using these rights? What's the process?
They have to notify the employer formally, in writing, say which rights they want, where, and provide proof they have enough members show representativeness.
Okay.
Then the employer and union have 30 days to meet and try to hammer out a collective agreement on how it all works practically.
And if they can't agree?
If there's a dispute, it goes to the CCMA, the Commission for Conciliation, Mediation, and Arbitration first for conciliation, trying to find agreement.
Yeah.
If that fails, it can go to arbitration, where an arbitrator makes a legally binding decision.
Right. Okay, now, for that historical deep dive into the South African union movement, especially 1950 to 1994, you mentioned distinct streams shaped by apartheid.
Yeah, it's a history defined by those divisions. You had early all-white unions focused purely on protecting white worker privilege. Then a multiracial movement tried to bridge gaps, but was often hampered by laws. And crucially, the non-racial black movement. Driven underground, it powerfully reemerged in the 70s, focusing on building strength on the shop floor and directly challenging apartheid from below.
And this reemergence led to some really key organizations forming in the late 70s, early 80s.
Hugely influential ones. FOSITU, the Federation of South African Trade Unions, formed in '79, a pioneering non-racial black federation. Then CUSA, the Council of Unions of South Africa, formed in 1980, often emphasizing black leadership more explicitly.
And you also mentioned community-based unions. How were they different?
Their power base was dual. Yes, the shop floor, but also massive support from the communities where workers lived. Unions like SAAWU. This sometimes created interesting dynamics, even rivalries, with unions focused only on workplace issues.
Right. Two sources of power.
Exactly. And you also had black consciousness unions like AZETU, the Azanian Confederation of Trade Unions, launching in '84.
And the mines. Unionizing the mines was a huge deal.
Oh, massively significant. By 1982, mine bosses, facing growing unrest, started giving limited access to unions for black and colored workers. This directly led to the National Union of Mine Workers, NUM, forming late '82.
With Cyril Ramaphosa as leader.
Yes, as General Secretary. Under him, NUM just exploded in size. By '85, it was the largest union for black workers. An incredible achievement, given the context.
So you have all these different unions, different strands. Eventually, they tried to unite. But it was tough.
Very tough. Long, difficult, often deadlocked unity talks in the early 80s.
What were the main sticking points?
Ideology.
Strategy.
Both. Big fights over union registration, should they work within the system or boycott it, industrial versus general unions. And the principle of black leadership was a major friction point. CUSA even walked out at one stage over that, highlighting the deep divisions.
But somehow they found common ground, enough of them anyway.
Eventually, yes. The ones who remained agreed on key principles: non-racialism, building industrial unions, the absolute importance of worker control, and basing representation on paid-up membership.
And that led to
The historic launch of COSATU, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, on November 30th, 1985, started with over 449,000 members, 33 unions, instantly a massive force against apartheid and for workers' rights.
a huge moment. Were there other players around then, too, besides COSATU?
Oh, yes. UWSA, the United Workers' Union of South Africa, linked to Inkatha, but never really matched COSATU's scale despite political backing. NSCTU, the National Council of Trade Unions, formed in '86 from the CUSA merger, keeping a distinct identity.
And TCSA, the multiracial one.
TCSA eventually dissolved in '86, couldn't really adapt to the more radicalized political climate. Later, FEDSAL, the Federation of South African Labor, revived and became the basis for FEDUSA in 1997.
It seems clear that because of South Africa's history, the union movement became almost the only organized voice for the majority. So industrial action and political demands were just inseparable.
Absolutely intertwined. You couldn't separate fighting for wages from fighting against apartheid.
Okay, let's shift to the new dispensation, post-1994 democracy. What did the landscape look like then? You mentioned many unions and federations.
Yeah, by 2016, you had 138 registered unions, 22 federations. But the dominant forces, especially representing labor at NEDILAC, were COSATU, FEDUSA, and NACTU, together representing over 3 million workers.
And some newer ones emerged, too.
Yes, CONSATU, the Confederation of South African Workers' Unions, in 2003, and more recently, SAFTU, the South African Federation of Trade Unions, which quickly became a very significant, distinct voice.
COSATU's journey post-94 seems particularly complex, full of dilemmas for a liberation movement partner now interacting with the state it helped create.
Incredibly complex. Their aims stayed focused on worker rights, social and economic justice, democratic control of wealth. Their structure still emphasized that bottom-up democracy ideal.
But they faced a big dilemma early on about getting involved in politics, right? Fear of losing focus.
Absolutely. Many unions were wary, but COSATU itself, given its history and the fight against apartheid, it was clear it had to play both an economic and a political role. It was instrumental in bringing about the new South Africa.
Which led to the tripartite alliance with the ANC and the SACP,
Yeah.
hugely influential in negotiations, but also brought immediate internal tensions.
Definitely. Right away, debates flared up. Was COSATU just a junior partner? Was the ANC consulting them enough? Huge fears about losing independence, becoming just a wing of a political party. Should they form their own party? Or stay fiercely independent, focused only on bargaining?
And then the brain drain, key leaders moving into government or business, that must have hurt.
It created real challenges. After '94, many top figures left. Concerns arose. Would they still push a labor agenda from their new positions? And internally, the remaining union leaders faced more pressure from militant members, while the new government often wanted them to curb that militancy for stability. A real catch-22.
So COSATU decided to stay in the alliance, but stressed independence on policy. A tricky line to walk.
Very tricky. And the pressure continued. The new government pushing investor-friendly policies like Gear the Growth, Employment, and Redistribution Strategy clashed directly with COSATU's focus on the RDP, the Reconstruction and Development Program, which prioritized basic needs and redistribution.
Gear and privatization were major flashpoints.
Huge points of contention. COSATU strongly opposed privatization. There was even serious talk of the alliance breaking up entirely, especially under President Mbeki, due to these policy clashes.
Right, things got quite tense between COSATU and Mbeki.
Very tense. COSATU grew increasingly unhappy with Mbeki's government-perceived neoliberalism, his stance on IVAIDs, how Jacob Zuma was treated. This pushed COSATU much closer to the SACP, and they openly backed Zuma in the ANC's internal battles.
Leading up to the Polokwane Conference in 2007, a watershed moment.
Absolutely. COSATU and the SACP actively worked to oust Mbeki and get Zuma elected ANC president. This, predictably, caused deep splits within COSATU itself. Some big unions, like Num MSA, were critical of the fierce attacks on Mbeki.
After Zuma won at Polokwane, did COSATU push for different economic policies?
Yes, they articulated a much more interventionist vision. Things like trade protection, state support for industries, devaluing the rand, more state-owned companies, bigger public works programs, a clear pushback against free market ideas.
But the internal drama didn't end there. What happened later under Zuma's presidency?
The relationship softened a bit initially, but key figures like General Secretary Zwelinza Mavavi remained vocal critics of corruption and policy drift. This led to bitter internal fights. Vavi was suspended, then controversially expelled,
Right, I remember that.
followed quickly by the equally controversial expulsion of Numum SA, COSATU's biggest affiliate at the time. This fundamentally changed the federation.
And it was around this turbulent time that the mining sector saw that huge shift, AMCU challenging NUM.
A truly seismic shift. AMCU rapidly gained majority status at Lonmin, the site of the tragic Marikana strikes in 2012. Lonmin then canceled its recognition agreement with NM, a massive blow.
And AMCU became a major force.
Yes, negotiating with mines, but also highlighting the plight of mining communities, focusing on broader social justice. They later affiliated with NAC2.
Okay, quickly then, what about the other big federations today? FIDUSA, NSC2, SAFTU. What's their main focus?
FIDUSA, formed 97, mainly focuses on worker rights, better conditions, wages via collective bargaining. NSC2, from the 86 merger, emphasizes anti-capitalism, non-racialism, strict worker control notably. Officials can't hold political party positions.
And SAFTU.
SAF2 represents around 30 unions. It's got a more revolutionary socialist orientation, focuses on things like a living minimum wage, jobs for all, housing, land, free education, a very distinct voice.
Right. Finally, let's touch on employers' organizations in the new era, still playing that bargaining role.
Yes, still crucial for centralized bargaining in bargaining councils, coordinating employer positions, representing them to government, providing advice on complex laws. SIFSA in the steel and engineering sector is a key example.
Are there powerful non-registered bodies too?
Yes, the Chamber of Mines, for instance. Not registered under the Act as an employer's organization, but historically and still today, bargains collectively with mining unions for employers in that vital sector. Shows influence isn't just about registration.
And the broader business chambers, SAFCI, AHI, and FCA.
They play a vital role engaging government on labor issues, even if they don't bargain directly. They provide that consolidated business voice.
And the push for business unity led to BUSA.
Correct. Business South Africa, BSA, and the Black Business Council, BBC, eventually merged into Business Unity South Africa, BUSA, in 2003.
The goal being
A single, strong, unified business voice when dealing with government and labor. And also, importantly, promoting Black economic empowerment within that unified structure. It's definitely given business a more powerful, coordinated presence.
wow. Okay. We have covered a lot of ground there, navigating this really intricate, dynamic landscape of labor relations in South Africa.
It's complex stuff.
From those surprising historical roots of unions and employer groups, right through to their legal status today, their internal workings, and that constant evolving dance with the state, you really see how these organizations, often born from conflict, have had to constantly adapt.
It's a fascinating field, yeah. Full of lessons about power, negotiation, the drive for social justice, and how it all shapes the economy.
Absolutely. And it leaves us and you listening with a really provocative thought to chew on. Given all the current challenges, new industrial revolutions, AI changing work, that constant tension between worker needs and business demands, how do these players, the unions, the employer groups, the state, need to keep transforming? What new kinds of representation or collaboration might be needed for them all to be genuinely fit for purpose in this constantly changing world of work?
Yeah.
How do you ensure both prosperity and social justice going forward? What stands out to you as the biggest challenge or maybe the biggest opportunity for these key players right now?